Welcome to the world of science fiction story, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the channel. Enjoy the listening. Elias moved toward the back, where a large crate sat covered with a tarp. He yanked it off, revealing an array of weapons, tools, and equipment, remnants of his past, things he had sworn he would never need again. Zyra's gaze lingered on the arsenal before flicking back to him. "You are more than just a soldier." Elias smirked. "Let's just say I got real good at staying alive." She reached down, running her fingers over the grip of a plasma rifle before nodding. "Then let's make sure we both do." Elias let out a slow breath, nodding in return. He could feel the weight of the coming battle pressing down on them, the inevitability of the fight that was marching toward them. The Valreich wouldn't stop, they wouldn't turn away, but if they came looking for a fight, then by God, Elias Fawn was going to give them one. The day passed in a slow crawl, the kind of waiting Elias had always hated. It was the stillness before the storm, the moment where you knew something was coming but had no way of knowing when or how hard it would hit. He had spent enough time in war zones to recognize the feeling, an almost tangible weight in the air, pressing down on everything, making every sound sharper, every breath a little more measured. Zyra felt it too. He could tell by the way she moved, the way her golden eyes flickered toward the windows every so often, how her muscles tensed at every distant noise. She was a warrior trained for battle, and warriors didn't sit well with waiting. They had spent most of the morning preparing. Elias had gone through his old gear, checking weapons, making sure everything was functional. Some of it was outdated, relics from a war humanity had already left behind. But firepower was firepower, and if it could still punch a hole through a man, it was good enough. Zyra had watched him with quiet calculation, taking stock of everything he had, weighing their options in that sharp tactical mind of hers. When he had handed her a rifle, she had taken it without hesitation, her fingers moving over the weapon with the familiarity of someone who had spent their entire life wielding death. It suited her. Elias had asked her once, in between the moments of silence, what exactly the Valreich would send after her. She had answered without emotion, listing off the possibilities like she was reading a report. A tracking squad at minimum. Hunters most likely. Enforcers if they had decided she was worth the effort. Elias had known mercenaries in his time, had fought against the worst of humanity's own killers, but something about the way she described the Val forces made his gut twist. They weren't just soldiers, not the kind that fought for land or power. They were something else entirely, something bred for war, something designed for conquest, and they would come without hesitation, without mercy. But Elias Fawn had never been the type to let fear decide his next move. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, he stood outside the barn, rolling a cigarette between his fingers as he stared out at the distant tree line. The field stretched for miles, golden grass swaying gently in the evening breeze, looking as peaceful as they always did. It was almost enough to make him forget what was coming. Almost. Zyra stepped up beside him, her gaze fixed on the same horizon. She had tied back her silver-white hair, her body no longer carrying the sluggishness of the injury she had sustained. The bandages were still there, wrapped tightly around her side, but she moved like they didn't exist, like pain was something she had long since learned to ignore. She was quiet for a long moment before finally speaking, her voice low. "Even they will not come in numbers at first," she said, her eyes narrowing slightly. "The Dominion does not waste resources on uncertainty. They will send scouts. If the scouts do not report back, they will escalate." Elias exhaled a slow stream of smoke, nodding. "Sounds about right." He glanced at her, studying her expression. "And what happens if they escalate?" Zyra didn't look at him then. "This place will not survive." Elias smirked faintly, shaking his head. "Guess we'll just have to make sure it doesn't get to that point." Her golden eyes finally met his, searching, studying. She had spent so much of her life surrounded by those who only thought in terms of surviving, in terms of duty and loyalty to a cause that wasn't their own. But Elias Fawn wasn't like them. He wasn't a soldier anymore, wasn't a man bound by orders. He was something else, something unpredictable. And despite herself, Zyra found that she trusted him. She nodded once, accepting the unspoken agreement between them. "We will need to position ourselves carefully," she said, shifting slightly. "If they come by land, we will see them before they reach the house. If they come from the sky, then we're going to have a hell of a time keeping them from leveling this place." Elias finished, tapping ash from his cigarette before flicking it into the dirt. Zyra studied the landscape again, her mind already working through the possibilities, weighing their limited options. "The trees," she said finally. "If we set up there, we can strike before they get close." Elias smirked. "You do much sniping, war maiden." Her lips twitched in something that might have been amusement. "I have killed from many distances, Elias Fawn." He chuckled. "Fair enough." Together they made their way toward the tree line, moving with the kind of quiet efficiency that only came from people who had seen too many fights, who had walked too many battlefields. The trees provided decent cover, enough to work with. And from this vantage point, they could see the land stretch out in all directions, the farmhouse sitting small in the distance. If someone came, they would know. As the last light of the sun faded, Elias adjusted his rifle, settling it against his shoulder as he scanned the horizon through the scope. Zyra was beside him, her own weapon resting in her hands, her body coiled and ready. They didn't speak, didn't need to. There was an understanding between them now, one forged in the quiet before the battle. Then, far in the distance, something shifted, a flicker of movement barely noticeable against the darkening landscape. Elias frowned, adjusting the scope slightly, his fingers tightening around the weapon. "There," Zyra murmured, her voice so quiet it was almost lost to the wind. He saw it now. 3 figures moving low through the tall grass, their forms barely more than shadows against the land. They weren't human. Their movements were too smooth, too deliberate. "Hunters." Elias exhaled slowly, steadying himself. "Looks like we've got company." Zyra nodded, her grip tightening around her rifle. "Then let us greet them properly." The night stretched before them, filled with the heavy silence of a battle not yet begun. But Elias knew, as he settled his finger against the trigger, as Zyra exhaled slowly beside him, that this was only the beginning. The Valreich had come, and now they would find out just what kind of fight they had walked into. The night air was thick with tension, the weight of the coming fight pressing down on them like an unseen force. Elias steadied his breath, his rifle pressed firmly against his shoulder, his finger resting just outside the trigger guard. He had been in this situation before, too many times to count. The waiting, the stillness, the knowledge that at any moment chaos would come rushing forward with the speed and violence of a breaking storm. Zyra crouched beside him, her golden eyes sharp and focused, her body coiled like a predator waiting to strike. There was no fear in her, no hesitation. Whatever was coming, she had already accepted it. Through the scope of his rifle, Elias watched the 3 figures move with calculated precision through the tall grass, their bodies low, their steps measured. They weren't just approaching blindly. They were scouting, testing the waters, looking for weaknesses. Whoever had sent them wasn't underestimating the situation, and that alone made Elias wary. These weren't the brash mercenaries or undisciplined thugs he had dealt with in the past. These were professionals, hunters, just like Zyra had warned him. And if they were the first wave, then worse was coming. Elias adjusted his grip slightly, his voice a low whisper in the darkness. 3 of them, armed, moving like they expect trouble. Zyra didn't take her eyes off the approaching figures. They will not attack outright. They are assessing, measuring response time. If we strike too soon, we give them information. If we wait too long, they will be upon us. Elias exhaled slowly. He had always been a man of instinct, trusting his gut over calculations, but he understood the game these hunters were playing. They wanted to know what they were up against before they committed to anything. The Val weren't known for their caution, which meant whoever had sent these scouts had enough sense to respect the unknown. And right now, Elias and Zira were that unknown. "We take the one on the right first," Zira murmured, shifting her rifle slightly. "Then the one in the center. The last will run. We let him. We need them to know that we are not easy prey." Elias smirked slightly, amused despite the circumstances. "Sending a message." She glanced at him. "Only the ones who survive carry messages." He chuckled under his breath, then settled himself, adjusting the scope. The wind had died down, leaving the night eerily still. He lined up the shot, centering the crosshairs on the head of the rightmost hunter. He could see the faint glow of their optics beneath their visors, the faint shimmer of energy shielding flickering as they moved. They weren't wearing full armor, gear meant for speed rather than defense. That was a mistake. Zira inhaled slowly beside him, her rifle following its own silent target. Elias knew the moment was coming, that breath between stillness and the pull of a trigger where everything hung in balance. Then the shot rang out. His rifle kicked against his shoulder, the sound cutting through the silence like a crack of thunder. The bullet found its mark, slamming into the hunter's skull just below the edge of the visor. There was no time for a scream, no moment of realization. The body simply dropped, collapsing into the grass like a puppet with its strings cut. Before the other two could react, Zira's shot followed. The center hunter barely had time to turn before the plasma round tore through his chest, the energy shielding flaring for a brief second before failing completely. He crumpled backward, limbs twitching as smoke curled from the wound. The third hunter moved fast, just as Zira predicted. They twisted, vanishing into the grass, sprinting in the direction they had come from. Elias adjusted his rifle, tracking the movement, his finger tightening on the trigger. But he didn't fire. Zira was right. They needed this one to run, to tell the others that whatever they thought they were walking into was far worse than they had expected. Elias exhaled, lowering his weapon slightly as the distant sound of retreating footsteps faded into the darkness. "That'll stir the hornet's nest," he muttered, glancing at Zira. She nodded, already rising from her position, her expression unreadable. "Good. Now they know that they must come prepared." Elias pushed himself up, rolling the tension from his shoulders. He was already thinking ahead, calculating their next move. The scouts were never meant to win this fight, only to probe, to gather information. But now that they had lost two of their own, the Val Rake would change their approach. The next group wouldn't be cautious. They would be an execution squad. Zira seemed to be thinking the same thing. She turned toward him, her gaze sharp. "They will come soon. He will not have to travel far to relay the message." Elias nodded, wiping the sweat from his brow. "Which means we don't have much time to set up." They moved quickly, gathering what supplies they could from the barn, reinforcing the weak points of the farmhouse. Elias pulled out an old set of charges, rudimentary explosives he had kept around for clearing land, repurposing them into crude but effective traps along the possible approach routes. Zira worked with quiet efficiency, securing firing positions, ensuring they had the best vantage points. There was no panic in either of them, no wasted movements, just two warriors preparing for a battle they knew was inevitable. By the time they were done, the night had deepened, the stars shining cold and indifferent above them. The silence had returned, but this time it was different, heavier. It wasn't the silence of an empty landscape. It was the silence of something approaching, something closing in. Elias stood on the porch, his rifle resting against his shoulder, his eyes fixed on the distant darkness. Zira was beside him, her own weapon ready, her golden eyes glowing faintly in the low light. They didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. Then, in the distance, the first light appeared, a faint flickering glow at first, barely visible against the blackness of the horizon. Then another, and another. Elias exhaled slowly, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "Looks like they're bringing the welcome party." Zyra didn't smile, but there was something fierce in her gaze. Let them come. The lights grew closer, shifting, moving. The hunters had returned, and this time they weren't coming to scout. They were coming to kill. Elias tightened his grip on his rifle, rolling his neck as he prepared for what was coming. He had spent years trying to escape war, trying to find some kind of peace in the quiet life of a farmer. But now, as the first figures emerged from the darkness, weapons glinting under the moonlight, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long, long time. A slow burn in his chest. Anticipation. He had spent years running from this kind of fight. Now he was ready to meet it head-on. The darkness swallowed the land, but Elias knew they were out there, creeping through the tall grass, their movements barely perceptible in the quiet night. The Valry hunters were patient. They were trained for this, for the art of the slow kill, for the dance of silence and death. They wouldn't charge blindly, not after losing 2 of their own. They had learned their lesson. Now they would move with precision, strike with calculated ferocity. But Elias had learned his own lessons in a different kind of war, one fought in trenches in burning cities, in the vacuum of space, and on backwater worlds where survival depended not on brute strength but on the ability to adapt. And if there was one thing Elias Fawn had always been good at, it was adapting. Beside him, Zyra crouched low, her rifle steady, her golden eyes reflecting the faint light of the moon. She was poised, ready, her breathing slow and measured. She was like a coiled spring, energy compressed, and waiting to be unleashed. He could feel the tension radiating off her, not in fear, but in readiness. She knew this fight was inevitable, had accepted it the moment she chose to stay. Now it was only a matter of execution. Elias adjusted his grip on his rifle, scanning the tree line ahead. They wouldn't come in a direct charge. That wasn't how they operated. They would probe, encircle, try to test weak points. They would strike where they thought their prey was vulnerable, overwhelming in numbers, breaking them down piece by piece. He had seen it before, the way disciplined forces dismantle the unprepared. But what they didn't know, what they had no way of knowing, was that Elias Fawn and Zyra Lynn weren't prey. A flicker of movement, just a whisper against the night, but enough. Elias exhaled slowly, settling his sights. He had positioned himself just outside the farmhouse, using the porch's cover, a strategic placement that allowed for a wide line of sight. Zyra was slightly to his left, positioned behind a stack of old farming crates near the barn, giving her an elevated vantage point. Between the 2 of them, they covered the only viable approach routes. Then the first shadow moved. It was subtle, just the faintest shift in the grass, but it was enough for Elias to react. He squeezed the trigger, and the rifle cracked through the stillness, a single precise shot slicing through the night. The figure staggered, a brief distorted shimmer revealing the outline of their energy shielding before the impact overwhelmed it. The body crumpled, disappearing into the tall grass. The silence held for a fraction of a second before the night erupted. A second hunter surged forward, moving with inhuman speed, his rifle raised. Zyra fired first, a bright burst of plasma slamming into the attacker's shoulder, sending him spinning to the ground. Another followed from the right, trying to flank, but Elias anticipated it, already pivoting, his rifle kicking against his shoulder as he fired. The shot struck true, hitting the enemy center mass, and the body fell with a lifeless thud. Then they came in force. 5 of them rushed from the darkness, moving fast, their forms flickering in and out of visibility as their active camouflage struggled against the muzzle flashes of gunfire. Elias ducked behind the wooden railing of the porch as a volley of energy rounds slammed into the structure, sending splinters flying. He felt the heat of a plasma shot sizzle past his shoulder, close enough to make his skin prickle. Zyra moved like a phantom, her form a blur as she shifted positions, firing with brutal efficiency. Her shots weren't wild or desperate. Each one was placed with intent, striking weak points, breaking through shields, dropping enemies with lethal precision. She was a warrior forged in the crucible of battle, and it showed in every movement. Elias rolled to the side, popping up from behind cover and loading a rapid burst from his rifle. One of the attackers took a shot to the leg, crumbling to his knees before Zira finished him off with a clean shot to the head. Another darted to the side, trying to close the distance, but Elias had already anticipated the move. He reached down, grabbing one of the makeshift explosive charges he had set earlier, and hurled it toward the advancing enemy. The detonation was immediate, a bright flash followed by a concussive wave that sent the attackers sprawling, their armor scorched and failing. But the Valreich weren't retreating. If anything, they were getting bolder. More figures emerged, larger this time, heavier armor plating gleaming under the moonlight. Enforcers, the ones Zira had warned him about. These weren't scouts. These were executioners. Zira dropped behind cover, her breath steady. "They are committing," she said, reloading her rifle with practiced ease. "This is no longer a probe. They mean to end this." Elias wiped sweat from his brow, his mind racing through options. "Then we need to even the odds." He reached for his communicator, switching to the old frequency he hadn't used in years. The connection crackled. A voice came through, rough and familiar. "Didn't think I'd be hearing from you again, Fawn." Elias smirked, even as another plasma round sizzled against the barn. "Yeah, well, I'm in a bit of a situation here. Think you can bring the cavalry?" A low chuckle. "Where?" Elias relayed the coordinates, then ducked as another shot nearly took his head off. "Sooner rather than later, if you don't mind." The voice on the other end didn't hesitate. "We're on our way. Hold tight." Elias shut off the communicator, turning back to Zira. "Backup's coming." She raised an eyebrow. "You trust them?" Elias smirked, firing another shot and dropping an approaching enforcer. "About as much as I trust you." For a moment, there was something almost like amusement in her expression. Then it was gone, replaced by cold determination. The enforcers were closing in, their movements precise, methodical. They weren't rushing now. They had assessed the battlefield, and they were moving in for the kill. But Elias Fawn had one thing they didn't: time. He just had to hold out long enough. He and Zira exchanged a glance, an unspoken agreement passing between them. Then they moved. The battle wasn't over, not even close, but they weren't dead yet, and as long as they were breathing, the fight would go on. The night pulsed with violence, the sky lit with muzzle flashes, and the crackling glow of plasma rounds carving through the air. The Valreich enforcers were pushing forward, their movements deliberate, unrelenting, a slow and crushing advance meant to break defenses and force their prey into the open. They weren't like the scouts. These were soldiers of war, bred for destruction, their armor reinforced, their tactics precise. They moved with the cold assurance of those who had never known fear, as if they were inevitable, as if survival against them was nothing more than a delaying tactic. But Elias Fawn had fought men like them before. He had seen the look in their eyes, the certainty that they were the storm, and he had lived long enough to know that even storms could be broken. From his position behind the splintered remnants of the poor trailing, Elias lined up another shot, his rifle kicking against his shoulder as he put a round straight through the visor of an advancing enforcer. The body twitched, collapsing into the dirt with a dull thud. But there was no hesitation from the others. They kept coming, stepping over their fallen without a second thought, adjusting their formation to compensate. They were learning, adapting. The pressure was mounting. Zira moved like liquid death, slipping between cover points, her plasma rifle singing with every pull of the trigger. She wasn't wasting shots. Every round she fired was placed with perfect precision, targeting joints, weak points, the exposed gaps in the enemy's armor,